Welcome to Northwest Digital News. Kevin Hunter here with Representative Jim Walsh, and we're going to give you some updates on what's been going on in the Washington legislature. Well, first of all, welcome, Jim, and thanks for joining us.
Good to see you again.
Yeah, likewise. So let's talk a little bit about the controversial ghost bills. You wrote a op-ed on this. You've touched on some other issues as well, and you have this barbecue or roasting attitude going on right now at the moment, don't you?
Well, the issue is catching traction with people.
Yep.
You can't always tell which ones will and which ones won't. But for whatever reason, the people of Southwest Washington and really the whole state are sort of catching on to this ghost bills thing that happened. And it's been going on for a few years, but it happened sort of dramatically this last session. And the ghost bills, of course, are the more formally known as title-only bills. So these are bills that a sponsor in the state capitol puts into the process with literally a title only. And the title will usually be something very, very generic. Legislation to support education. Okay,
What's that?
Who's going to oppose that, right?
Yes.
And then, so it gets put into the hopper, it gets put into the process, and gets a bill number. And so you're a legislature, you're like, all right, well, fine, what's this one? You go pull it up, and it doesn't say anything. There's no body to the bill. Usually all it does is repeat in the body section of the bill the title. So legislation to support education. Well, that doesn't tell me anything. What's this? And the plan is, the sort of parliamentary trick, is that they put this bill forward. And you can't really have a hearing on a bill that says 2 words.
Right.
So there's no hearing. There's no public comment. There's no ability for there to be a debate or any of the perfecting or amending that happens in a regular bill along the way to the floor of the legislature. But they push it along. It gets to the floor. And what they end up doing usually is using a floor amendment, which is a legitimate part of the process, to put the body text of the bill into the bill. So
But they're doing it at the 11th hour, so
course.
you don't have any of the rebuttal or
no debate, no back and forth. We usually, even the legislators will see it often a few hours before it comes to a vote. Sometimes a day before, but usually the same day. And so it's hard, you read it, you do your analysis, you talk to some of your staff lawyers, you try to get as much response as you can, but it's hard to debate a bill that you just read a moment ago.
So the now famous statement about we have to pass this so we know what's in it, that was actually really in
They've
effect.
taken it to heart.
They've taken it to
Nobody,
Oh my
most of us talk about that ironically, but in Olympia, they've taken that to heart. And we saw this happen in a prior session with this ill-fated Legislative Public Records Act that we tried to do in Olympia. That was really a terrible piece of work, but done the same way, kind of secretively, no ability to review, and it got to the floor, and people were just told, well, vote yes for this, because it's a good bill for transparency. And it was not, of course. It was a terrible bill for transparency, but it had all the title of a public records.
And the whole process itself was not transparent at all.
It was like performance art.
Yes.
Make a bill about transparency that's not transparent and do it not transparently. So that one went down in flames. Actually, it passed the legislature, but then there was so much public outrage about it when people did finally get to take a look at it, that our governor, who is not exactly a profile in courage, actually found some courage in that case and vetoed it. And then there was so much public outrage, there was not enough support to override the veto. In that situation, I was a no all along. I'd voted no because I don't like these ghost bills. So flash forward to the session that just ended. We didn't get just one sleazy ghost bill. We got, well, depending how you count it, between 5 and maybe as many as 8 or 10. But really 5 ghost bills that were the most outrageous. And that was 4 bills that made up the bulk of the tax increases we saw this session. So that is the bill that increased the business and occupation tax in Washington, which is our main business tax, a bill that increased the real estate excise tax, or REIT, which is, it shows up, and to most people know it as a closing cost when you close escrow on a real estate, buying or selling a house or a lot, piece of land or something. When you got all those fees at the end before you close, the REIT is one of those, and they jacked that one up real high. And then they got rid of the out-of-state sales tax exemption, which is important to our part of the state. People come across the river from Oregon, go
right
shopping.
on the border.
You know, if you can show an Oregon driver's license, you used to be able to not have to pay sales tax, which was good for drawing local merchants and retailers could draw people to come across the river and shop here. They got rid of that, so that'll be hard for our local retailers. And then the fourth one was a gasoline tax increase, done in a kind of slippery way at the wholesale level between wholesalers and retailers. They increased that barrel fee higher up in the production line on petroleum. So it'll end up kicking up your price at the pump by 2 cents or 5 cents a gallon, depending how they apply it. So those were the four, that B&O, business tax increase, the REIT, the sales tax exemption, and the gas tax. Four taxes increases, and they did them all as ghost bills. They all started out with no language. We had a sort of a general idea of what they were going to do with these, but we couldn't see anything. I mean, we couldn't see the details, couldn't read the language until the last minute. And then they were passed literally in the cover of night. I mean, at midnight, 2 o'clock in the morning, we're all kind of weary out there on the floor, and that's when they run the tax increases.
Right.
And it was just as sleazy as it could be.
You know what confuses me about all of this, and maybe confuses isn't even the right word, because we're seeing more and more of this, but they're not even pretending to not be slime balls about this. They're just actually throwing it right out in somebody's face, and it's like robbing a bank in the light of day. You know,
and not wearing a mask.
And not wearing a mask, yeah, just going, we're here, we're going to steal from you, and that's it. So, I mean, this whole process from beginning to end with this Ghost Bills is obviously and very clearly the most sleazy way to introduce anything.
And they're doing it shamelessly.
Yeah, and they're doing it shamelessly. Like, they're just proud of it.
Well, I don't know if it's proud, Kevin. I think it's fear. I think at their core, the proponents of these bills are afraid, and rightly afraid, that the people of Washington don't want these tax increases. And so it's bold and it's brash, like you're saying, but it's not driven from strength. I feel it's driven by weakness and fear. Right. And as I've said,
I'd agree with that.
Yeah, and the Seattle left and their contingent at the state capitol has had a winning streak. I mean, they've been doing well for a long time in terms of controlling legislative process and policy debates, but you kind of get the feeling they're at the end of their run. And you don't do these sleazy tactics like this if you're on the rise. Right. I mean, if you're on the rise, you put your tax hikes out there, you let people debate it, you let them try to amend it. If you've got the majority, you don't mind because you got the votes, so let them try to amend it. I've got the majority anyway, I'm just going to run it through. That's not what they're doing. They're like nervous and afraid and sneaky.
I also would add to that is if the idea or what you're doing has merit, very legitimate merit, you throw the idea out on the table as soon as possible.
The free market of ideas.
Yes, exactly.
That's why I got into legislating. That's the best part. That's when it's working. That's the best way. And these guys, they don't want any part of that. They're bad at debate. That's the other piece. The Seattle left and Olympia, they're bad at floor debate. They keep losing floor debates. And so they don't want to have a floor debate about, let's say, the B&O tax increase, because we clean their clocks in the floor debate. We've got the stats, we've got the numbers, we can show the bad effects that it has. We can show that when you raise the business tax on a CPA, that the CPA raises his or her rates that they charge their customers.
Sure.
And then those customers, if they run a business, they just pass the CPA's fee on to the consumer. We can show that this ends up affecting the cost of things at the store or online or wherever you do business. And we're ready for that debate. We want that debate because we can show it's bad policy.
Right.
And they don't, so they sneak it in the middle of the night. And like I say, it's just the feeling I'm getting, the kind of vibe in Olympia about this stuff, is these guys are at the end of their run. Like they sense they don't have a lot of time left with the majorities that they've had in the legislature. And so they're cramming through all these bad ideas they want, but not doing it in a strong and open way. And I hope they're right. I hope they're at the end of their run. And that in the next election cycle, or maybe the one after that, the pendulum swings back to a more evenly divided government in our state.
So, quick question, budget-wise, what's the financial health of the state? I'm just going back to a question that when you push through a bunch of taxes and say we need all these increases, logic would say that, well, we're in a big financial hurt, and therefore we need all this extra money and et cetera. What's the financial health of the state?
No, it's the opposite. We were outperforming projected tax collection on the existing taxes before all these new taxes.
Right.
We run a 2-year budget in Washington, as many states do, and our 2-year budget before the last session, so the last 2-year cycle that just ended, we were at about $48 billion for that 2-year cycle. So 24, a little bit of change per year. This budget that we just passed, 52 and a little change $billion, 2-year cycle. So up about $1 billion a year, maybe a little more, about 26, 27 billion a year. And so most of that, getting from 48 billion to about 50 billion, a little bit more, we could have financed just with existing performance, coming in above projection. So there was no need. We could have increased the size of our budget with no new taxes. The about $1.5 billion, $2 billion that takes us up to 52 and change. Those were the new taxes. So about $2 billion in the 2-year cycle in these new taxes. You'll sometimes hear different numbers reported on these things because the state is required to budget not only in a 2-year cycle, which is literally what the budget is, but we also have to do budget projections for a 4-year cycle. And the purpose of that process is supposed to be to give a better, little slightly longer term view on the effects of spending and tax receipts. So sometimes you'll hear that the tax increases are 4 or 5 billion. And if you hear that, what that usually means is someone's looking at that longer range effect of the new taxes. But the immediate 2-year, writ in black and white budget effect is about 2 billion on the new taxes.
So if you're ever wondering if somebody's trying to grow government and government's influence in your lives, well, one of the clues is they'll grow the tax base even when they don't need to.
Correct.
Because what are they going to do with this money? What's the plan?
Most of it goes to the general fund, which is the black hole.
Which is the scariest place to put it.
Exactly. We don't do a good job in Washington. We are not allowed by our laws and our Constitution to earmark in the way that the feds do. That is, tie specific money directly to specific purpose, the way that the feds do it. But we can do what we call allocate. We can allocate funds that are directed to a specific department of the state government or a specific purpose. We can allocate funds. And on our side, the fiscal conservatives, we always want to allocate as much of the budget as we can.
Sure.
We want the dollars to be specifically targeted for specific uses and not left to the discretion of bureaucrats on how money's going to be spent.
You don't want the tax collector in the government sense to be sitting on the other side of the cash register, and when this exchange of money is going on, they're going, you know what, I'll just put that right here for now, and we'll figure out where it goes later. That's just a scary proposition.
And it's been scary for a decade or more. King County and the city of Seattle, through their effective and strong-armed representation at the state capitol, have been taking more than their share of some of these general fund receipts for, projects that are not necessarily bad projects, but not efficiently administered. So when you get into the Puget Sound area in Seattle and you see how they spend money, for instance, on low-income housing. Now, no one's going to object trying to find good low-income housing projects, but these are not really efficient. My metric when we talk about low-income housing or homeless housing projects is show me the number of beds you've created by expending this money. And that's the easy measurement. How many apartment units or new beds are available because of a project? And a lot of these homeless housing projects up in Seattle, they don't like to answer that question.
Right.
Because the truth is, there's a lot of consultants and there's a lot of outreach and there's a lot of overhead spending that doesn't get translated into beds. And, you know, I hope that these guys are at the end of their run. I hope that those of us who are the more fiscal conservative side get a little more control in the legislature, because we need to audit some of these expenses. We need to go and look hard at how this money is being spent. Now, in our area, in our part of the state, we actually do a pretty good job, and people do answer that question, how many beds get created. And we've got groups, you know, Community House is one locally, Salvation Army is pretty good on these issues. There are a number in our area that are pretty effective at helping get people off the street and get low-income housing set up. But we could do more. And if we were spending our money more efficiently, we don't have to raise taxes to do better.
Sure.
We just have to hold the spending we have now to better account, and we'll do better. We'll create more beds.
You know, what's interesting is government doesn't at all work like private individuals do. And I think about even in my own household, I look at like what we've done with our income over there, and it's steadily increased. And you look at like what your expenses are in the household, and my wife does a fantastic job with this. So overall, what we actually spend on our daily needs, our monthly needs, really hasn't changed for some period of time, but the income has steadily gone up. So the difference between that has steadily grown, and it's a huge credit to her. But in many people on the private side might relate to that even in their own household. But the thing that voters and citizens have to understand is that never happens in government. When that income, the tax base continues to increase, they're finding new ways, new things to spend that money on. And at some point, you start to wonder, when we look at our erosion of our way of life here in America and how that's happened, it happens when you give lawmakers, when you give government more and more of your money, and it continues to happen. That's how you lose the freedoms and rights that you have.
Mechanically, the budget process in the government level, it can take two forms of budgeting. It can take baseline or basis budgeting, or it can take zero-base budgeting. And what baseline or basis budgeting is, show me your budget from last year, and we will make a new budget, tweaking your budget from last year here or there, usually increasing it, bumping it up a little bit. But we use your last budget as the starting point for a negotiation of your new budget, department of X, Y, or Z.
Right.
And this is where you hear these stories where the departments want to spend all their money at the end of their fiscal year because they want to have all their money from last year spent and then ask for a little more, and they get a 3% or a 5% bump up.
They don't want to get to the end and have a savings account.
What we need more of is zero-base budgeting, which is, okay, Department of X, Y, and Z, let's start from zero. What do you do? What are all your departments and sub-departments? And let's give them a budget starting from zero based on what we think they're going to do in the next couple of years. And, you know, what do you find when you start with zero-base budgeting? You can often fund the essential activities of a state agency for less than what they got last year.
Right.
And you can actually save money for the taxpayers. But in Olympia, there's a big resistance to doing zero-based budgeting. But we're arguing more and more for zero-based budgeting. The way it has been in Olympia recently is only when a state agency gets in trouble for some reason do they then have to go through zero-based budgeting. And we saw it recently with the Department of Fish and Wildlife, which had some scandals and some bad behavior in its management and some problems. So they went to zero-based budgeting. So everything got reviewed. And, you know, we're still kind of grappling with the effects of that, but all in all, I think it's the best way to budget state agencies, and federal agency, any agency. So there's going to be, like I said, if the bad guys, if the big tax and spenders are truly at the end of their time, and if the pendulum swings back, we will see some good things like zero-based budgeting. We will see good things like no new taxes. We will see some good things that I think will help the state be strong. And there's a lot of prediction that nationally and even internationally, we're looking at some kind of a recession or correction coming up in the next year,
a lot of people
18
predicting
months.
that. Yeah.
So if we do get there, I think we can make sure the state's in better shape to withstand that and get through it okay. If we tighten our trim our sails a little bit, and that's what we ought to be doing now. But we'll get there. I'm confident that the next cycle or two is going to be good for the fiscal conservatives.
So that we don't want to run out of time, I want to make sure that we talk about Northwest Innovation Works.
Yes.
This has been a big turn of events in the governor's office, and you wrote an op-ed here recently taking him to task for this. Actually, describe the process of you submitting that to the paper and then what they decided to do, because this was actually kind of a funny story.
I've been talking with one of the local papers. My district is a pretty big geographic district. It's got 5 counties in it. So I've got a number of papers that are in my district. So I talk with each of them from time to time, and we do edit boards and things. But I periodically will offer to do an op-ed on an issue in the news, and they like that, and it's good. So I was talking with one of the
and they're well written, by the way.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yes,
I try
they
to. And they're not ghost written.
Yeah.
Olympia is actually very careful about that. Staff is not allowed to write op-eds.
Yeah.
And the staff on my side in the caucus, when I write a firebrand sort of angry, let's clean this up type of op-ed, they'll often get calls. Did you write that for Walsh? And they're like, no, we can't write those kinds of op-eds. We can only do background research in a very limited informational way. So anyway, this one was, I was talking to the paper, and it was the Chronicle in Lewis County, and we'd been talking about this. The governor's flip-flop on supporting Northwest Innovations, which is a proposed methanol plant in the town of Kalama, which is just a little bit south of here. So I've been talking to the paper, and we talked about text messages and things. This is a good topic, And so I was really kind of fired up when I wrote this op-ed. I was really unhappy with the kind of cheesy, cowardly way the governor had done his flip-flop. I mean, sometimes you got to change your position in politics or policy, and if you do, hopefully you can explain why. New facts emerged. I got new information. I changed my mind. This wasn't like that. This was done in a very cheesy, kind of nervous way. All political, having to do with our governor is, of course, running for president. And it was all tied up in his run for president. So I was pretty angry about it. The governor had supported this project in Kalama, and rightly so, because it will use natural gas to create methanol instead of coal, which you can also use to create methanol. And the process of using natural gas to create methanol is much cleaner to the environment in terms of a carbon effect than using coal to create methanol is. So, if you're an environmentalist, if you're a greenie and you think we've only got 12 years in the world and all that stuff, you should be for this project because it's taking coal kind of out of the game and using the much cleaner natural gas to create the product. And that was kind of that was the governor's position for a long time, for years, was he supported the project because it was replacing, it was getting coal kind of out of the production stream. Well, recently, just about a week ago, he did this really craven flip-flop. Now he doesn't support the project. And he can't really, he sort of hemmed and hawed and said, well, to do the things that we want to do, which in his mind I think means get elected president, we can't have anything that does anything that does anything. It was very poorly done. And then he had to have a spokeswoman come out and say, well, this is what the governor meant. He actually meant, and she more coherently explained why they flip-flopped. It wasn't even that compelling, but she tried. So I wrote this op-ed, and I was kind of fired up. And I said to the paper when I sent it to him, email it to the editor. I said, well, here's this op-ed on this flip-flop on the governor's part. And I admit I was a little angry when I wrote it. If it's too hot, send me some notes back, and I can dial it down and make it a little less angry. No response. The op-ed appeared in the paper one day later. So clearly it was not too hot. They thought it was appropriate to the topic. It's bad. It's a bad situation. That project would be great for the environment, great for the global climate. It would be great for jobs in our part of the state. I mean, it would be a real good facility with several hundred, maybe more, union family wage jobs there. In my opinion, it's one of the rare sort of win-win-win type of projects for our area. And the governor turning his back on it is just craven. It's just bad. And of course, what he's doing, he's not having a lot of success in his bid to run for president. And
I've noticed that.
Yeah, but he's radicalizing. He's becoming more radical in the attempt to get attention for his presidential bid, and that's really unfortunate. That he shouldn't be doing that. I mean, I don't think people want a far radical as their president. I think people tend to want practical problem solvers as their presidents, and so anyway.
For people here in Washington who haven't been paying attention to Governor Inslee's presidential run, if getting 100% of the vote was the goal, he's been trending at about 1%, so he's got a lot of holes to fill. So I guess maybe that's what he's trying to do.
He's been between 0 and 1, and what we said was when he was still stuck at 0 was he could double his poll standing from 0 to 0. He's not catching traction. A lot of people speculate that he's not really running for president. He's trying to get a cabinet position or something in a future administration in D.C. But at 0% or 1%, you don't even have much to negotiate.
You have to be a realist
for a cabinet position. I mean, you got to get to like 10% to have enough delegates to negotiate for something later.
Sure. Well, let's talk a little bit about two things I wanted to have a little conversation about before we leave here today. What impact has the current budget changes in the bills that went through? What impact on either school levy or property tax?
Yeah. So a couple of years ago, we fixed the so-called McClary decision in the state of Washington, which was a state Supreme Court decision about how we fund K-12 schools. Very controversial. Basically, what the state Supreme Court said was the way you're collecting money at the state level for schools is screwed up, and you've got to fix it. And what they said was the state, it's the state's responsibility to fund basic education. And they said you're palming off too much of that responsibility onto local jurisdictions. The state has to provide basic ed. Now, the local jurisdictions can add. They can do what they call enrichment. So they can buy fancier band uniforms, and they can do things like this, or they can pay for a club to travel somewhere to do something. But basic ed has to be statewide so that every school in the state has the same basic level of funding.
Sure.
And they said you're relying too much on that enrichment local money to pay teachers and do other basic ed things. So we rejiggered our calculation. We fund our schools primarily through property tax. So we readjusted the property tax calculation so that the state portion was bigger, local portion was smaller, and that satisfied the state Supreme Court's requirements. And the state Supreme Court has said, yes, that adjustment does satisfy our ruling, and we're done with this issue. Well, as a result, some of those schools that were using local funds to do things like pay teachers
Hi, I'm Jim Walsh.
now have
U.S. state representative. Good schools.
Sorry about that.
That's right. I was talking
I was
online.
clicking
about
on
good
your
schools.
site, and this thing popped up and started playing. So
that got fixed to the state Supreme Court satisfaction. But those that were using the local money to pay teachers and do other basic things kind of had to change the way they did things. And some of that was kind of painful for them because they were accustomed to using that local money for the basic ed expenses. So there was some adjustment going on there. And a lot of those school districts said, well, we don't like the fact that you lowered the local piece and raised the statewide piece. We want to have a larger local piece. And you have to say to them, well, that's kind of what the state Supreme Court said you can't do.
Right.
So, but we want to use it. We still want to do more enrichment. And so there was a big debate. And as a result, you have to add in too, in the adjusting of the funding, there was basically a one-time kind of windfall for some school districts because of how the formula was calculated in collecting and also distributing. Remember, there are two parts of funding schools. You collect the money at the state level, and then you send it back out to all the school districts around the state.
Sure.
Well, the sending it back out part is controlled by a thing called the prototypical school budget model. And this is bad. This prototypical school budget model is screwed up. If you hear people talk in Washington about how our school district only qualified for a 0.8 of a counselor, that weird stuff like that, where they only get a fraction of a bus driver. That's all because of this prototypical school funding model, which says for every X number of kids, you get 0.8 of a counselor or 0.5 of a bus driver. And bigger school districts don't care, because when you got a ton of kids and you're up to, are you going to have 40 bus drivers or 41? The difference isn't that much. But in a small district where it's, are you going to have one bus driver or two? The difference of rounding half a bus driver makes a big difference.
Yeah.
So we got to get rid of this prototypical school funding model. I'd like to see us go to a straight per kid, basically per capita allowance. You've got 1,000 kids. Well, each kid around the state, each kid gets, a school district gets $2,500 a kid. So if you got 100 kids, if you got 1,000 kids, just take that number, multiply it by $2,500, that's your budget. Get rid of this formula. The formula jammed up some school districts, plus this one-time windfall they got in adjusting monies that they would receive, so that some school districts use that money to negotiate contracts with their teachers and other employees that counted that one-time windfall of money as if it were every year.
Sounds like a bad idea.
And end up with these contracts that are not sustainable in the long term. So that's why you're hearing stories around the state of school districts having to lay off employees here, some teachers there. Usually the people getting laid off are non-certified employees. That means not teachers, but the support staff helping the teachers. Because the teacher contracts tend to be very strong and ironclad. So we got to fix this, basically. And so what we did this time, a couple of things. We passed a piece of legislation called the Hold Harmless Agreement, which basically said schools that are getting kind of the raw end of the deal because of this prototypical school model get some bonus money, basically, that they can use as they see fit to fund more teachers, hire counselors, paraeducators, whatever they want to do. So we got that passed and funded. So school districts that were hurt by that get some short-term relief. Now that's kind of a Band-Aid. That deal only lasts 2 years. It's a budget item, so it's only as long as the budget. Long-term, what we got to do is get rid of that prototypical school model altogether. The other thing we did was we allowed the local portion of the taxes to get a little higher. So school districts can raise their local levy to fund enrichment. But if they slip into the old practice of using it to do things other than enrichment, we're going to be right back into the McClary lawsuit land again. And the state Supreme Court said, we're watching you guys. So if this happens, we may decide that the McClary, you were compliant, now you're not compliant anymore, and we're back to having to restructure everything by court order. So we got to be careful about that. Now, when you're looking at your tax bill or hearing about school funding in your area, you'll hear about school levies. You'll also hear about school bonds. And levies and bonds are two different things. The bond, a school bond is usually to build a new building. It's usually a capital budget item. A school levy is an operating item. That's raising more money for the new band uniforms, stuff like that. So what you're going to hear about in the next few years is schools trying to run either bonds or levies increases. And I recommend, if you're a fiscally conservative person, look to the bond. The bond is probably what you want to emphasize, because that builds you. It's a tax-funded thing, so you're paying more taxes if you say yes to a bond, but it builds you physical stuff, physical plants, a new school building. And that's generally a safer bet than a levy, which is more tax money, but going to enrichment and operating things that may or may not be a good deal. So, look them all over carefully, but pay a little more attention and have a little bit more of an inclination to say yes to a bond, as long as it's well articulated and they can explain what they're going to build with the money. And give a little bit of a harder look to a levy.
Very good. Well, great stuff, Jim. And we'll have to have you back.
Oh, there's so much more we can talk about.
Heck yeah.
We passed, there was another ghost bill this time that restarted affirmative action programs in the government here in Washington, which we haven't had in 20 years,
Right.
and opens the door to quotas in government hiring and government contracting. Very troubling. And that one was that was the fifth ghost bill I talked about. So done in that same shady way, and that one's going to have a lot of effect on politics in Olympia for the coming years, and we can talk about that more detail another time.
Well, to give our viewers a little bit of a update, a preview on something that's coming, we will be taking remote broadcasts to areas around the state, including
you
areas
mentioned
within your district, and we'd love to have you come and participate in some of that conversation.
Yeah,
So
it'd be great. We have a great, like I said, a big geographically large district, and it's great to get out there and see some of the coastal areas and see some of the farms and dairy farms and ranches we have. We have a lot in the 19th district, so that'll be a great thing.
And a good thing to give our citizens a voice in what's going on. Well, thanks everybody who are joining us here on this legislative update. Kevin Hunter with Jim Walsh here on Northwest Digital News. We'll be back with another one down the road. Thanks for joining us. This concludes today's live programming on Northwest Digital News. Thanks for joining us for this special broadcast. Heard around the world in more than 70 countries on YouTube, Instagram, Patreon, Facebook, and Twitch TV. If you enjoyed a story or guest we had here on Northwest Digital News and would like to strut your stuff on the broadcast, email us today at wainfo2017@gmail.com or call or text 360-545-3501. We're always interested in unique stories, topics, and guests to share with our worldwide audience. Before you go, don't forget to give us a big thumbs up and comment on the live stream. And for those of you who'd like to financially support the broadcast, you can do so at patreon.com/Northwest Digital News. We thank you for your patronage. On behalf of Chris Bornstead, Kyle Torgeson, Stephanie Hunter, and all the people that made this broadcast possible, I'm Kevin Hunter. Till next time, take care.